Hello and welcome to another edition of Something or Other. It's myself, Mick Fealty, and my old friend and mentor, RG Gregory. Now, those of you who've seen us in the last, that's Greg. Hi, Greg.
Well,
So, look, those of you who've seen us over the last few weeks, we're trying to do a whole series of like half-an-hour talks, and I'm really quite serious about trying to make it down to half an hour. This week, I set the idea of we're going to speak on the importance of form. Okay, that's form, not format, but form, the shape in which things are done, and specifically the nature of assembly, so to speak. And Greg and I have been talking about previously, I think, the importance of dreaming last week, the importance of having dreams and being able to shape dreams and bring them to reality. Particularly in the context of a democratic system, which certainly, as those living in the UK will know, in its current format, the US format is pretty very crude and doesn't really allow for an awful lot of options or an awful lot of dreaming beyond what those options currently offer. So today we're going to look at the importance of form, and I don't see any viewers in yet, so I'm going to just hold back a minute. Greg, just take us into this whole business. When you talk about form, what do you mean?
I mean, it's a spiritual form. And I don't mean that in a religious way. I mean, it's something which contains the possibility of the content within it. Something which gives shape to the content, to the delivery of that content, right? It makes the content. It provides a space within which a certain content can be content, a certain content which grows within that space. And that form holds that content until the content fills up the form. And then it gets to a point where it says, I can't stand this form anymore. I've worn it out. And so the form then has to change in order to take the budding new content. And then when the form changes, right, because it can't contain the ideas that are pressing on it, when the form changes, then the content that was becomes inadequate. And so a new content has to begin to develop in order to start filling out the next form. It's the paradigm. Within the paradigm, a form develops that is sympathetic to the paradigm. There's this basic statement of what it is to be a human being in this universe. But then, as the paradigm, the form, right, uses up the content, or the content uses up the paradigm, and the paradigm can't cope anymore with where the ideas are going, right? The paradigm bursts open and another paradigm has to form, has to come into existence. And when that second paradigm comes into existence, all that was and sympathetically received becomes old hat, becomes not workable anymore. And a new content, a new kind of seed has to grow in order to work with the soil that the new paradigm is suggesting. And those are the eras. Each era, as it were, as I see it, creates its paradigm. The paradigm creates its content. The content wears the paradigm out, and the paradigm bursts open, and a new paradigm has to be thought. And that's where we are now.
Where, Greg, does form come into that?
Where does
form fit into paradigm and content?
Well, it's really another word for it. The form is the shape. I mean, in terms of theater, in terms of assembly, right? The form is provided by where the listeners are, where the audience is to that which is being grown, that which is being said. And if you then look at theatre, as I think I've probably said many times before, the shape of the space, or the relationship of the actor or the speaker across a space to where the people are creates the nature of the form, and creates therefore the paradigm, how that form, how that content can be received by the people who are receiving it. And if those people are on one side, they receive it in one way. But if the audience is all the way around, then that things are happening to that content that the content might not necessarily have meant when it was stated, because there are the things that content has to go through to get to all those ears all the way around.
Okay, so just a quick word to the audience. Those of you who are finding us, it's my fault that it's got so complicated. I set the whole thing up as an event rather than set it up as a hangout on air. So we're now in a convoluted position where it's maybe quite difficult to find us. If you can find us and you want to throw some questions at Greg and I, we're talking about form tonight. We're talking about the nature of assembly, how that changes over time, and how form serves content, but content also helps to find when cultural assumptions begin to change or social assumptions begin to change, and that content begins to break down form and look for other forms to kind of recapture itself and recapture social meaning, if you like. So that's where we're at. Please do hit the Q&A button. Send us your questions. We'd love to hear from you. Join in the conversation, and Greg and I will try to process some of those as we go along. The sooner we get them in, the better. We'll avoid what we did last week, which is trying to cram too many in right at the very end. So don't be shy. Throw your questions in, and we'll do our best to pick them up on the hoof and try and play with them. So, Farnes, welcome. Amelia, welcome. Great to see you here. Please do throw those questions in. So, Greg, some examples of how form works on content, how it constrains content in certain and particular ways.
If you put somebody on a platform and that person speaks off the platform down to the people, then already the journey that the words that the person on the platform uses down to the people gets affected by the nature of the relationship of the speaker to the listener. If you and the platform becomes a kind of part of a tower. If you raise people above other people, then what they say becomes more significant than what the people below can say. And the audience has to accept that. Therefore, on the platform is somebody who is an expert in their field, right, who has something to say that is considered more important than the audience can say, because the audience is there simply to receive the wisdom of what's being said. Now, if you change that form, and supposing you get people sitting in a circle, and the person who speaks is in the middle, the person who speaks from the middle has a very, very different journey to make. That person can't just stand in the middle and speak, because there are people all the way around. But at the same time, because the voice goes forward, right? And you have to imagine the voice being thrown backwards as well. But as the voice goes forward, it seems to be being addressed, say, to somebody on side A, or on, one part of the circle. And that person receives it and receives that language as if it's spoken directly to them. But at the same time as that language is spoken there, people behind are picking up the language, but they're also picking up the reaction of the person who listens in the first place. And they are seeing something that the speaker can't see. So the nature of the language becomes something different. If you're sitting in a circle, there comes 360 degrees of possibilities about that same language. So the language cannot be that absolute statement of the speaker to one person, or as in, say, a proscenium theatre or an end stage theatre, to a small arc of people, right, who may share, to a degree, a similar viewpoint. They all think they're hearing the same thing. They're not. Actually, they're all hearing a different thing, interpreting it through where they sit, right, and in terms of what lives they've had. But the way the language reaches them is a different, takes a different direction, a different perspective. But if people are sitting all the way around, then the moment people get out of the eye shot of the speaker as the speaker speaks, they're getting a very, very different view of what the speaker is doing. They may be distracted by his hands. They may be distracted by the fact he hasn't, the back of his head or whatever. And the meaning of that language subtly or even obviously begins to interpret differently. If you put and so the form that you put something in changes the total meaning of that language to that assembly. And if you put somebody, the form that we're used to, and what's interesting is even people who philosophically are against the implications of that form still use that form to communicate because it's the only one that they know, right? Our mouth is in the front, we speak forward, we want to be heard, we want to be seen, so we put ourselves up on a platform and direct it to people down there, usually sitting in the dark while the speaker is in the light. All that is changing the nature of the language that is being spoken. It heightens the value of the language from the platform and reduces the quality of the quality of the relationship for the audience, whose job is simply to sit there and receive and to keep quiet. So you begin to change the form, changes what is actually being heard. And if on a stage you have lighting and sound effects and all those things, all those are distorting the language, the meaning of the language that gets given out to the audience. But since we're not in...
Because, Greg, if I could just interject there, because in a sense, it is serving a particular social purpose where the speaker on the stage is, in that format, the most important person. The message is prefabricated, pre-created, and that people are passive receivers, and that's a form that we recognize from proscenium arch stage, through to radio, through to television, and even into cinema. But the change, say, from that format, which is traditional, or we think of it as traditional, it's only 300 or 400 years old from the Renaissance and on, that the moving of that act, the assembly of theatres, so to speak, from the stage into the center of a theatre in the round, you're saying that creates a very different set of relationships, and the demand for those relationships is almost what's calling out the form or the idea of form. Now, in theatre, it's not, theatre in the round still not particularly popular. So in theatre, it hasn't become popular, but we might posit that that one artifact that we do have that's recently built and which does not conform absolutely to the proscenium arch idea that authority is placed in one place with all the lights shining on it, just like now on this kind of screen, so to speak, and that is being broken down in new spaces, like, for instance, as we've talked before, the connected internet, where those connections are absolutely the connections are almost infinite, are flat, so to speak, between peer to peer, individual to individual, and chaotic, and disruptive, constantly disruptive of settled conversations, and disruptive of authority, or those who would set up authority. Now, before you answer that, Greg, or come back on me on that one, can I just say thanks to all those people who are watching. Do note that if you can see the Q&A app, just hit that, and if you've got any questions for Greg and I, please just send them in. We'll get them here. We'll try and get through them. We've got another 15 minutes before we're due to close down. We can squeeze that a little bit more because we started just a little bit late. But I don't want to leave all the questions to the very end like we did last week. So please do step forward. Anything you're not understanding, anything you want Greg and I to cover, please do throw them up there. We really enjoy we enjoy the disruption, if you like, to the authoritative narrative we're trying to push out here on this late discussion. So, Greg,
I mean, it's a breakdown of absolute truth to relative truth in one sense, because everybody sitting around receives the truth differently, right? If only slightly, they receive the truth differently, and they absorb it within themselves differently. But it goes. The thing, there have been a number of letters and papers I've read over the last few days where this is actually being explored in a way similar to the way that I've explored it. There was a letter in the Guardian, I think, from Anna Ford, which talked about this idea of the direction. I can't remember exactly what word she used, but this idea that authority doesn't have to come from up high, doesn't have to come off a stage, doesn't have to come off a raised platform. It doesn't have to be delivered from a different light in which the audience sits. That's my sort of further thing with it. It's a different way of understanding the truth, and it is the round is the symbolic statement of equality. The platform or the tower is the symbolic statement of hierarchy, right? And we see this hierarchy at work in all the tall buildings that get built. You go to a city, you look at tall buildings and you say what goes on in those tall buildings, you know what counts in that city. So as business takes over the center of London, all the buildings are banks and, you know, great sort of statues to finance and things like that. Whereas there used to be churches and cathedrals.
Greg, I'm going to bring this right back to form, and Farnaz Parsey, who's watching us, is going to help us do that. The question Farnaz asks is, I experience what was said, i.e. that form changes what is actually being heard, especially when cultures are different. So when you're talking about this form change, that transition from one form to another, will there be a loss in translation and a reduction in the quality of the relationship?
I mean, translation changes it, all right? But actually, we live in a world now where English is practically universally spoken, and that's because in colonial times that language was imposed upon people. But even then, there's a translation, because a Chinese speaker will pick up what is being said in English differently from, say, a Russian speaker or an Indian speaker or someone like that. I mean, or even Australia, where it's English spoken, will pick up because of the way that English is developed there, or in America, but we'll pick up slightly different meanings from this. That's That's within that. But what makes the form there is actually the relationship between the standing of the people against one another in the eyes of history, in the eyes of, the question of the power and the ordinary. We live.
Okay, no, I just wanted to just interject, because I want to bring it back to what I think Farnes is getting at, and this is my interpretation, Farnes, that I may be wrong. But I think there's a question here, a core question about form, not language or translation as such, but when you shift, say, from doing something in the round to doing something in the round to doing something on the stage to doing something in the round, is there something lost, or does it change? What happens when the relationships change in that new form? Are we finding something? Are we losing something? What's that qualitative shift in relationship to us?
Yeah, we are losing something. We're losing the meaning of the language, the meaning of the gesture as required by the authority, as required by the hierarchy, to a thing, to another situation where what is being said is being shared symbolically with people all the way around. There will be differences of interpretation, okay, but the fact is that the actor in the middle, because it is impossible to see everybody at the same time, whereas the people sitting in the audience can see all of themselves at the same time, that shifts the meaning of the power that is being exercised in that space, from the power of the actor to the power of the audience. A lot of theatre groups work in the round, but still, because they've been trained to work off platforms, they still play in a platform way to people, but it doesn't work. And so what happens is, in a lot of sort of professional plays in the round that I've seen, other things come in, like design, like the use of music, like the use of things beyond the language, in order to, as it were, still keep the people in the dark, still keep the people at a distance from what is actually being said. Whereas the form invites people in. And that sort of, and says, you are of the same world as I am, mate. You're not in a special raised lit space that makes you different from me. You're using your skills in a certain way, but those skills have to be accessible to me in an equal way, because you are at the service of us, of the people around. We give you in round something that you don't get when it's on a stage and everybody's done. But it's not only theatre, it's in the general nature of assembly. I used to be a teacher, and I used to go to the NUT annual general meetings, and I discovered that the relations there between the committee, as it were, that sat on the platform, and the rest of the delegates who sat where the audience sits, was as hierarchical and as confrontational as in any other form. As you know, those meetings were conducted, as it were, as shadows of the way that we conduct our business in this country, between the hierarchy, between the government and the people. We give more power to the few. If you take the tower, and when you take the circle, right, that the circle of the people, you cannot. What happens is you can only get a certain size circle at the bottom. But if you try and move that circle up a bit, it becomes smaller. then it becomes smaller because the constricting sides of the tower don't allow you to rise very far. So gradually you get to a point where right at the very top, there's a very small circle. And that circle, right, controls what happens in all the other circles below, right? And that's those symbols are tremendously important and powerful to how we actually conduct our business, no matter what gets said. And I don't think
that we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left. I just want to read this in, Faranez. I'm not sure we're going to get an answer to this one, but Faranez says, how can we avoid that? I think the loss or the mistranslation between one form and the other in the virtual world and in written communication. I've got. She also asked another question of what's your general definition of form, inverted commas. So that's maybe 2 things to come back to. Fairness, for what it's worth, without going back to Greg on that thing about loss, I think the truth is that there just is loss when you switch from one form to the other, and some things have to be lost. In other words, in order to move to another form to gain something else. So if you lose, but that's just very, very quickly. I think I would like you to have a go at defining the general definition of form again. I know we covered it briefly at the beginning. And there's something from Pete Cooper here, which I think is also worth sharing. I think what makes the form that emerges from abstract struggle collectively owned? Can we make the language accessible and inclusive and cross-class and culture? So that, in a sense, I guess if we look at the paradigm theory in terms of scientific change, that's Thomas Kuhn's kind of borrow, if you like, from grammar back in his book in 1960 or so, when he looked at how scientific revolutions take place and in the imagination as much as in reality. What he talks about there is that say a given scientific theory will seem to serve us well an explanation of some kind of natural phenomenon until people begin to ask questions that it fails to. So in a sense, it's a form. It's a formal idea that appears to fit, given natural phenomena. And it holds sway, it holds authority until such times as it begins to completely break down. And it seems then it's almost as though somebody asks a question that it can't answer. And at that point, public confidence begins to break down in that particular theoretical form. And at that point, there is a scrabbling, according to Kuhn, there is a scrabbling around for a potential answer to the question that the existing paradigm or the existing theory cannot answer. And that is a kind of if you were to put it in Arthurian terms, that's almost the knights all disappearing off into the jungle or through the forest and cutting their own way to try and find a new way of answering the questions thrown up or the dilemmas thrown up by the new question. And I think that's a kind of it's the quest in a sense to find a new form that the knights all disappear off on their various quests too. And they come back and go back to Kuhn. They come back and they each compete to answer the question. And I think the collective ownership comes from that form, or that form of theory or theorem that seems to answer the question adequately and practically enough so that people can then get on and start to ask new questions and go new places. And I think that for me is not exactly a direct answer to both Faranez's question and Pete's question, but there's something there around form as, what makes it collectively owned? Well, I suspect it gets collectively owned when it collectively answers the questions that people are asking. And now, not in science in this case, but in social terms, in terms of social assembly, that it becomes popular when it begins to become socially productive and answer many of the questions that are being asked now because of the breakdown of old social paradigms.
Yeah, I think form is, I forget what Eliot's phrase was, but it's the outward expression of a spiritual assumption. And right at the core, right, of what it is to be a human being is the nature of the spiritual assumption that gets made by the temporal about the infinite. That is, we look at this world that stretches well before us into nothing at one end and nothing at the other, and is timeless, and we can't sort of get it all in our heads. And the body of the time makes a kind of an assumption about what that relationship is between the temporal and the infinite, and then gives itself body by interpreting it in all sorts of ways, architecturally, through language, right? Through all the means of communication that people have between each other, they start worrying away about what this spiritual assumption is saying. When they start with a first spiritual assumption, then that wears itself out. They find that it doesn't work like that. And so the form in which they can the form in which they can live has to alter, because the first form, the first spiritual assumption, doesn't answer the questions that they are now facing. And that's the moment of the change of paradigm, right? Because that first form wears out its content. If this is the true relationship between the temporal and the infinite, right, then all these things are possible. But then you find that they're not possible at a certain point. So you have to create a new spiritual assumption about what is possible. And that spiritual assumption leads to the change of form, within which a new kind of content, a new series of answers, a new series of questions and answers have to be posed in order to correct what we feel to be a failed understanding of the relationship between the temporal and the infinite. And that goes on and on, right? It takes time. It's not something that happens today or tomorrow. It can take hundreds, it can take thousands of years. I think we are now at this moment at the end of a spiritual assumption that started with Babylon in imaginative mythological terms. And that basically is the rape and the death of the mother goddess by her son, who then takes over. So the feminine principle that the mother goddess stood for, and that principle is that we are all of the same blood, right, changes to a striving principle. No, I'm different from you. I've got further to climb than you. And that becomes the masculine principle, the driving force. That changes from the circle, right, which is an earth circle, which is about understanding the earth around us, coming to terms with the animals, the fauna and the flora around us, to wondering, how do we get up into the sky? How do we defeat these gods who have this hold on us? How do we become gods? And that has happened, that's gone on, pushing its way through all sorts of religious movements, all sorts of sociological movements, philosophical movements, right? And there's almost a clear trail, almost a logical trail of how that has developed up to the present view of what that relationship is between the temporal and the infinite. I mean, is the infinite a thing on its own, or is the infinite just an assembly of temporals? And that's worn itself out now. We don't have the answer. It's worn itself out philosophically, because on Earth we don't know how to cope with it. We don't know how to cope with these relationships between people on this Earth. So we're breaking out now into another spiritual assumption, another form.
Greg, we're going to have to leave it there because we're running out of time. In fact, actually, we've run over time, as is our wont. Before we go, and I thank the viewers for coming to see us live and for some great questions earlier on. Brilliant that you got those in earlier, Pete and Faranez. But there's a blog I saw, it really written in response to the UK election, and whether you agree with the politics or not, there's a few interesting. It's one of the more interesting analyses because it's not really about the party politics of it. It's really about how politics is done, and it sort of seems to me to be pointing in this direction of form rather than getting caught up with the content of whether you're a Tory or a Conservative or a Labour Party person or a Scottish nationalist or whatever. And it's by a guy called Dougald Hine. That's DOUGALD.NU. And if you look it up, the only way is down. 18 notes on the UK election. But this particular section, I think, is worth reading out aloud. Then I remembered something Martin Shaw says in one of his mythic metaphors for making sense of the kind of times that we're in. Where is it? In which we're living. And he said, this isn't a hero time. This isn't a goddess time. It's a trickster time. When people like John Berger, one of my heroes, were young, it was a real thing to believe in the heroic revolution that Marx had seemed to promise. Today, the only kind of revolution that is plausible is a foolish one where we accidentally stumble into another way of being human together, making a living and making life work. And, open brackets, whatever that might look like, it doesn't look like utopia. And I think that's not a bad way to kind of describe that, stumbling into a new way of doing things, a non-pre-planned, not Thomas More's kind of idea of this is the kind of paradise we must work to, because it's in the plan and you can see it's all written down. But this, and which is very much the Renaissance, Reformation times. This is a chaotic time, a time of tricksterism and charlatanism and fast-moving light and chaotic relationships and things like that. But that seems to me that captures this kind of short, sharp, difficult period in which we're living, in which the old answers don't seem to cohere quite in the way that we have been brought up and educated to believe that they would. But look, I'm going to leave it there. Just thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks, Faranez. Thanks, Pete, for your questions. And thanks to everybody else. Join us next week. I will properly set up the event page on Google Plus this time so that it's a Hangout on Air and not just an event page that doesn't have a Hangout on Air on it, so that you can see all the more easily. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your questions. And thanks to Greg. See you next week around about 9:30.
Cheerio.